We talk a lot about gun culture here at T-Rex Arms, and today we're going to be reviewing a book that says that it emerged from the military surplus sales of World War II era hardware and some stuff that happened around that time in the 1950s and 60s. Welcome back to another T-Rex Talk. My name is Isaac Botkin, and today we're going to be reviewing a book by Andrew C. McKevitt called Gun Country. And the subtitle is Gun, Capitalism, Culture and Control in Cold War America. And essentially, the thesis of this book is that current modern gun culture that we have today, this idea that we should be free to own weapons, that really comes out of a culture that developed in the 1950s when there was a whole bunch of military surplus stuff, specifically small arms, being sold to Americans. And it is a pretty scholarly book in a lot of ways. There's about 40 pages of notes at the end. It is well researched, and I actually enjoyed reading this book in a lot of different places in a lot of different ways. But I do have a little bit of an argument with the author on his original sort of presuppositions. He does document a lot of stuff that did happen, and it did have a big effect, but I think that there's stuff that happened prior to that that is pretty important. So let's get into some of his ideas. In the introduction to the book, Professor McKevitt makes the case that war made the gun country. America is, of course, the gun country. I would not dispute him on that term. The Second World War and Cold War provided the immediate inspiration for growth and expansion of gun ownership and the justification for it. Now, this is an area where I'd like to see a little bit more research because I actually believe that there's a significant amount of firearms ownership in the United States prior to World War II, and the availability of M1 Garand and various other military surplus rifles that came back over to the States after the war. There are a whole bunch of things that happen after that. There are a massive amount of Cold War era things that happen that he does document later on in the book very well and are really fascinating. Like after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have all these Eastern Bloc nations just filled with various Soviet military hardware, and they would like to sell it. So there are a bunch of things that happen in the 20th century that do sort of flood the market with cheap small arms. But this idea that America became the gun country in the 20th century is one that I immediately sort of take issue with. I've read a lot of other books on the podcast sometimes. This one is in defense of the Second Amendment by Larry Correia. Most of the books that I have reviewed on the podcast have been more anti-gun or pro-gun control. I need some recommendations from you guys on more pro-gun and gun history books that I can be reading and reviewing on this podcast. But in Larry Correia's book, he mostly talks about the political side of things, but there is some history in there, and the history goes back pretty far. So right off of the bat, the presupposition that the author is bringing to this topic kind of shines through. In fact, in many ways, you can see that in the very first page of the book. There is an acknowledgement at the beginning for my grandfather, Carl E. Fozzie, who would have hated every word of it. So right off of the bat, we can see that, to give the author some credit, it isn't clear whether his grandfather would have hated this book because it is opposed to private firearm ownership, or if he hated this book because he would agree with his grandson and he would have hated all of the things that are documented in here. But then at the end of the book, he describes that his grandfather would have in fact hated the ideas in this book. So right off of the bat, he is starting with an agenda that he realizes his grandfather and other people from the past would disagree with and even hate. And that just, it's hard to argue that you don't have an agenda or that this book isn't really pushing a barrow in many ways. And it comes out, obviously, very quickly as you read the book. But some of the scholarship in here is really excellent, but a lot of the scholarship is cherry-picked is not the word, but it is pretty one-sided. There's a lot of discussion about guns being imported into the United States. There's a little bit less discussion. I was hoping for more, considerably more stuff on the military surplus and all that was done with everything that we created for World War II, because it's fascinating. The War Department created so much stuff in the 1940s, and we gave a bunch of it to the Soviets, and we gave a bunch of it to the effort of rebuilding Europe. There were farmers in Europe that were plowing their fields, towing these large plows behind tanks and various other tracked vehicles that we gave away. We gave away huge amounts of small arms, huge amounts of aircraft, and we destroyed tons and tons of military surplus material. I wish we had kept more of those airplanes. I've read just a little bit about how this was operated, because most of the logistical stuff that happened in World War II was creating all of that stuff and getting it over to Europe. What happened with it afterwards is really interesting, but I haven't spent as much time on that, and I had hoped there would be more of it in here. But pretty much all of the focus is on policy stuff that is happening in the 1950s and the 1960s. So I think that the research that we see in this book is really solid on that stuff, but it doesn't really support the claim that the military surplus and the availability of weapons is something that happened pretty suddenly in this space of time, and that is the reason that Americans were resistant to all of these proposed policy changes. He talks about Nixon, and he talks about LBJ and various other gun control friendly presidents, I would say, and gun control groups, and the formation of the gun control advocacy groups that we have today. And he also talks about the pushback. There's a lot of pushback from the American populace who would like to continue to keep and own their guns. And I don't think that he fully connects the dots between the Americans want to keep their guns because they got such a great deal on them from World War II, especially when he does talk about some World War I military surplus. He talks about Lee Harvey Oswald quite a bit, and kind of this very interesting, there was this brief thing that happened in the 60s. You had Lee Harvey Oswald, obviously famous for shooting somebody with a high-powered rifle from a book depository. But then there was also the bell tower guy down in Texas who was sniping at people. There was a brief craze, a panic. People were deadly afraid of snipers. Newspaper reports talked about sniper nests being found various places and sniper kings battling it out inside of these urban areas. And that turned out to be, just hype. Very, very overblown. In fact, he even has a quote from a newspaper editor who told the Kerner Commission later that we used things in our leads and headlines during the riot I wish we could take back now because they were wrong and they were bad mistakes. We used the word sniper kings and nests of snipers. We found out when we were able to get our people into those areas and get them out from under the cars that these sniper kings and nests of snipers were the constituted authorities shooting at each other. So there was this panic that was very much artificial. And this is something that he goes over in the chapter 3, title This Means War. And he goes over these different race wars and riots and things revolving around the Black Panthers, stuff that you have probably read about. This idea that Republicans were okay with gun control in the early 60s because of race riots and because of the Black Panthers. But then, as the gun control movement began to expand, they were not okay with it because they were afraid of communists and because they had all this great World War II military surplus hardware lying around. But this is not an idea that is unique to Andrew McKevitt. This idea that military hardware is lying around America and it's turning it into a battlefield, a battleground, a warish hellscape is something that was widely discussed in the late 60s by people like President Lyndon Baines Johnson himself and his attorney general and various people in his administration said things that were, well, the book even acknowledges are not entirely true. LBJ acknowledged that 750,000 Americans have died since the turn of the century, far more than have died at the hands of our enemies in all the wars that we have fought, which is untrue. And McKevitt says here, the precision of these estimates mattered less than the intention inciting them. The American gunscape was a war zone in ways that the everyday landscapes of other civilized nations were not. I would beg to differ, especially in the 60s. There was a bunch of stuff going on in other nations that were actual war zones. The administration's political goal was not rigorous accuracy. Instead, the regular repetition of numbers in the range of 750,000 to 800,000 gun deaths across the 20th century, along with accompanying figures on international comparisons, were meant to draw Americans' attention to the unique nature of their gun problem across time and space. What metaphor could be more appropriate for a landscape overflowing with guns and littered with the victims of violence that guns had enabled than a battlefield? So even here in this chapter, where he talks about the fact that a lot of the panic that the media had stoked at that time was wrong, it was incorrect reporting, and it inflated fears and it inflated victim statistics beyond what was accurate, he still says this is a great metaphor because the idea is sound. The metaphor is good because the political goals and aspirations are good. And this is pretty early on in the book. And then he goes on to cover more of the stuff that is happening in the 60s and the development of the various anti-gun organizations or pro-gun control organizations. And this is, in my opinion, where the book really shines. It's not very good at making the case that there is just tons and tons of military hardware that's being used. In fact, the book relies way too heavily on outliers. For example, there is, in Chapter 3, another fascinating outlier. There is a guy in this book, William Thorson, who gets a number of pages dedicated to him because he collected a huge amount of war material. And to be fair, it isn't just small arms, it is some anti-tank guns. The 37mm anti-tank gun complete with wheel carriage. By the way, I have friends that own these things. I have a number of friends in the military reenactment community and also just in the historic gun community that have collected stuff like a 37mm, terrifying caliber anti-tank gun. I even know a guy who, not by himself, because this is outlandishly expensive, he and a group of friends own a German 88mm field piece, which is a live fire piece. Every single round that they create has to be registered as a destructive device, but it still works. There are reasons for people to collect these things, and it's not as horrific as this description. The other thing is that Thorson doesn't do anything wrong with any of this stuff. Now, he is a problematic character because he is the heir to Chicago's Great Western Steel Corporation. So he is a spoiled rich kid and a jerk at a time, the mid-60s, where spoiled rich kids and jerks get up to a lot of trouble. But his trouble is things like punching ticketing agents when they don't let him get on his airplane, which probably would have been Pan Am at that time. He also detonated 50 pounds of dynamite in the Arizona desert, close to a radio station. He probably didn't know that he was close to the radio station. He said he detonated those things because he was bored. So we have this bored heir to a colossal steel fortune who collects stuff. And the book goes over and over how the ATF, which were not the ATF at the time, they were the ATTD. They were part of the IRS at that time, part of the Treasury Department, the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Division. They kept raiding him and collecting his stuff because he had all of this stuff, this really dangerous stuff that he had bought and he had purchased, and it never actually caused any trouble. As you go over the collections and the lists of things that he had bought and the times that he was punching people and the time that he tried to bribe some Las Vegas cops to get him out of an issue with a lady, which, again, it was the 1960s and he was a spoiled rich kid and a total jerk. So, yeah, not cool, but also has nothing to do with his 37mm anti-tank gun complete with wheeled carriage. By the time you get to the end of the William Thorson story, it's actually very anticlimactic. It keeps talking about guns, and it keeps talking about violence. The only violence appears to be him punching that ticketing agent at the airline counter, and then his wife shooting him. So that's the end of that story. So the book is full of outliers like this, which sound really scary, and they sound indicative of a major problem. And yet, a lot of the problem that is discussed doesn't really emerge in the pages of the book because he is picking these really extreme outliers. I wish what he had done is spend a little bit more time on some of the things that were actually going on in Baltimore, in Baton Rouge, we'll get to Baton Rouge in a second, and in Chicago. Because when he shifts gears and starts talking about the people who begin to organize to put some restrictions on firearm ownership, the book gets a lot more meaty and a lot more interesting. Instead of crazy outliers, he's talking about real people, and the research gets more solid, and I find it very fascinating to see the way that these things develop. And I wish I had a little bit better window into 1960s and 1970s Chicago when some of this stuff was starting to develop. The Civic Disarmament Committee of Chicago was one of the first to really make major strides in this area. And I enjoyed reading about Laura Fermi. You might have heard about her, or maybe not. She was the wife of Enrico Fermi, who worked on the atomic bomb project. But she was one of these little old ladies in tennis shoes, a community organizer who, on her own volition and on her own dime, tried to solve actual social problems that existed inside of Chicago. And I have infinitely more sympathy for her than modern, like Moms Demand Action type gun control groups. If you go back into the podcast archives, I think it's about a year ago now, we did an episode, I believe it is called the Gun Control Industrial Complex. And it talks about how Michael Bloomberg and some of his groups basically swallowed up all the smaller gun control groups, and they became this very large, mechanized, homogenized machine. And I actually, much as I disagree with them, miss the days when people actually wanted to solve problems in their community themselves. And let me look up the next group, which I enjoyed reading about. The Coalition of Concerned Women in the War on Crime, CCWWC. It sounds like some sort of wrestling federation, but it was in fact 40 black women in Chicago that wanted to solve the issue of crime that was tearing their community apart. And they were interested in a lot of solutions, not just gun control. They wanted to figure out how to solve issues with police, issues with corruption, issues with Chicago that are, I mean, they're really obvious even today. But even by the end of the 70s and going into the 80s, you can see some of these smaller grassroots organizations being swallowed up by larger operations that are being done in Washington, D.C. People who are doing massive amounts of fundraising, people who have the ear of the President of the United States, people who are the advisors to the Attorney General. You start to see a lot more power behind some of this movement. And that's where you begin to see him document some of the pushback. Of course, he talks about the NRA quite a bit. He's actually, I think, much more nuanced on the NRA than most authors. Most of the NRA commentary that you see from this side of the political fence is just incredibly lopsided. The NRA is this giant boogeyman. It is the largest and it is the most powerful entity in Washington, D.C., spends more money on lobbying than anybody else put together, and it has literally enslaved most of the Republicans and some of the Democrats. But in his research, he has actually discovered that there's a bunch of pro-gun and anti-gun, and the NRA sits kind of in the middle. He even documents some of the NRA compromises that happened at the time, and the ways that Second Amendment Foundation and Gun Owners of America and various other groups were troubled by these things, and the ways that they went about pushing for legislative changes or preservations of freedoms themselves. However, he also ties a whole bunch of UN stuff and communist stuff and John Birch Society stuff in here, which I think is appropriate because it is all pretty tied together, but I don't know that he doesn't support it well enough with his research for me to know whether or not he has a really solid understanding of it. And he also brings Japan into it quite a bit, and there's a couple reasons for that. One of them is that Andrew C. McKevitt is a John D. Winters Endowed Professor of History at Louisiana Tech University, and he is the author of Consuming Japan, Popular Culture and the Globalizing of 1980s America. So this is his time period that he seems most comfortable in, the 70s, the 80s, and he has done a lot of research on Japan. In fact, one of the key stories that the book kind of revolves around, he discovered while researching his other books on Japan. And it is the story of Yoshi Hattori. And this is another story that is kind of an outlier in one sense, but also does work pretty well to hold the book together. So Yoshi Hattori is a 16-year-old exchange student who is going to high school in Baton Rouge. Baton Rouge in the early 90s is, it's a pretty high crime part of the country. And on Halloween night, Yoshi goes to a party, but he gets the address wrong and he goes to the wrong house. And he disturbs the people who live in that house who are already jumpy because of some other stuff that's going on domestically. And they confront him, but he can't speak English. So when the owner of the house pulls a gun on him, he does not respond to any of the commands, and he raises his camera to show that he is harmless, and he is shot. It is a tragic, tragic scenario. It is a terrible mistake, but it also is a really complicated situation. 9 times out of 10, if somebody comes to your house at night on Halloween in Baton Rouge, you pull a gun on him and he refuses to respond to any of your commands, and then he comes towards you with a device, lethal force is probably a safe option. In this case, it was the incorrect option, but the jury of that particular criminal case found the shooter not guilty of manslaughter. In many ways, that case is kind of an outlier because it's just sort of a freak occurrence, something that is tragic, something that is incredibly sad, something that could have been avoided many different ways, and something that really has nothing to do with the gun itself. It isn't like the shooter has one of these military surplus guns. It's just a standard .44 Magnum Ruger. It would make more sense if the book were about how Hollywood has made certain, Clint Eastwood-style guns look cool, so people have too many of those. But the reason that this story does fit in this book, and the reason it's kind of central to the book, is Japan got very involved in international anti-small arms, international ideas where, I'm trying to remember the exact flow of events, because he ping-pongs back and forth between very tightly focused personal stories, like the story of Yoshi getting shot and the story of his parents coming over to America for the trial. He zooms way in on those and gets very deep, personal, emotional details of this tragic story. And then he zooms way back out to what is happening where Japan is trying to get onto the UN Security Council, and they want to have a particular political thing that they are doing that, is peaceful. Japan wants to be on the Security Council, but they want to do something that is expressly peaceful. And so they are really trying to get America to adopt legislation that will prevent the private ownership of firearms, just like Japan has. That is their PR campaign for the UN. He goes back and forth between these giant geopolitical moves and these super tight Baton Rouge neighborhood things, and there's a lot of stuff in the middle that seem a little bit hazy. But then he starts to talk about the fact that there are these weird right-wingers, these weird bitter clingers that have their guns and their religion, and they don't want the UN coming in and taking away their guns, which was never going to happen, even though the Japanese nation was demanding that the UN actually do that. And this is where the book gets into the 90s, where things start to get a little bit more familiar with stuff that I remember very personally. Things that were happening in Baltimore. We live just outside of Baltimore. The Clinton assault weapons ban, stuff like that. And this is where I think the research in the book is the best, but I'm going to zoom out myself now because it doesn't really necessarily support some of his main ideas. This main thesis that America became gun-friendly because of military surplus and cheap imports, the conflict between people who want cheap imports and people who don't is something that is touched on in the book, but not in a way that delves very deeply into economic factors. Because the fact is, yes, many people were very opposed to cheap imports, but it wasn't always just anti-gun people. There were plenty of American firearm manufacturers that were also opposed to cheap imports. There were factories in small towns in America that made firearms that were opposed to cheap imports, not because they were opposed to gun ownership, but because of specifically international economic stuff. And a lot of that stuff is just kind of breezed over. The other thing that I really wish he'd spent a little more time on was this idea of gun capitalism. He talks about gun capitalism quite a bit, as if firearms exist in a separate sort of economic sphere. A great example of this is when he's talking about Lee Harvey Oswald, and he's talking about Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle, and the fact that he was able to get ammunition for this rare, sort of rare, Not exactly rare because it was imported in large quantities, European rifle, because people set up ammunition factories to make ammunition for it because demand was high. Well, that's not really a feature of the gun economy. That's just basic supply side economics. He also, though, does make the point that the CIA helped with the importation of some of those guns and helped with the creation of some of that ammunition because they wanted ammunition that was available because these rifles were spread across the entire world. I think the CIA may have been involved with Lee Harvey Oswald in other ways besides ammunition, but we can move on. I think that what he's trying to do is coin a phrase. Gun capitalism is a great phrase for an anti-gun person in academia because gun is a scary word and capitalism is a scary word. So this idea of gun capitalism is something that I think that he really wants to happen. But he doesn't really make the case that this is different from regular economic activity, regular machining, regular tools, regular imports, or regular supply side and basic demand type stuff. I wish that he spent a little bit more time on that, but he does get back to it towards the end of the book here. He also hates loopholes, but he doesn't really seem to understand how the loopholes are going to work. Like he talks about cheap revolvers being imported, and then a law that said that revolvers couldn't be imported, but then people kept importing the parts, and he calls this a loophole. It's not really a loophole. If you pick very specific, focused, targeted things, people will work around those very specific targeted restrictions. That's not a loophole, that's just literally how things work. If instead of trying to solve a problem at the root level, you create a super tiny focused fix, a super tiny Band-Aid, people avoiding that Band-Aid isn't really a loophole. That's just normal activity. That's what humans do. But even though his presuppositions and some of his clear agendas are visible throughout the book, it isn't really clear what he personally thinks or wants to do until the last chapter. Then he actually has some specific, he actually calls them wish lists that he would like to see happen. And this is pretty fascinating. The last chapter is probably the most interesting, unless you're interested in some of the stuff that happened in the 60s and 70s that is documented in the middle of the book. This is the one that is the most interesting to me. It is a discussion of some of the stuff that revolves around T-Rex Arms customers and T-Rex Arms audiences and some of the very recent developments inside of the gun culture. He talks about AR-15s and other black rifles. He talks about how Call of Duty has made people familiar with them and want them. He talks about stuff that we have talked about a lot. He talks about bump stock bans. The government takes action after the Las Vegas shooting, even though he admits bump stocks were statistically insignificant for killings beyond Las Vegas. And some would say, even in Las Vegas. He says the foundations of gun capitalism remain secure. There isn't hardcore movements against this developing gun capitalism. Now, here is where I think it would be interesting to try to develop that gun capitalism idea a little bit more. Maybe call it something else. Maybe call it the gun industry or the citizens defense industry. Just talking about gun capitalism, I think, misses the point. There have been changes over the last few years. The AR-15 has become a dominant platform for a whole bunch of small, decentralized firearm manufacturers. That's really, really interesting. And tactical stuff is more interesting to people, but it isn't just the availability of this cool stuff. It isn't just Call of Duty and John Wick and some of these other cultural things that are making this happen. Those are factors, and they're probably bigger factors than I think they are. Being afraid of commies back in the 60s, being able to buy M1 Garand rifles, probably a factor, but a pretty minimal factor compared to some of the larger cultural things that have happened throughout our country's history. I would really like to explore this gun industry idea, even though gun capitalism is kind of a dumb logo or a dumb phrase, which he keeps coming back to. President Joe Biden signed into law legislation that offered no new ideas for reining in gun capitalism, but instead sought to strengthen existing gun control regimes. I do like the fact that this gentleman is thinking outside of the box. He realizes that doing these little tiny incremental things are accomplishing very little, and really super focused things always create loopholes or, workarounds. But as he goes on in the book, he starts to describe some of the issues that he sees. Even even if America always has been and always will be the gun country, there's nothing natural or inevitable about the kind of gun country that it is today. The same post-war forces that produced the gun country also produced Laura Fermi's abolitionist vision and the Committee for Handgun Control's innovative use of gender and consumer identities. Despite the endless cycle of heartbreak and legislative obstruction, tens of millions of Americans continue to organize and fight for change. So he sees these two sides. He sees the gun ownership is a right that we should maintain and continue to engage in the gun capitalism side by purchasing more and more things. And earlier on, he does admit that there are hundreds of millions of firearms in the United States, and confiscation isn't really an option that can be on the table anymore. Then he also sees the other side of the fence, which are, and I think he does the best part of his research in documenting some of these folks who popped up in the 60s and 70s really desiring to solve crime, and some of them got laser focused on gun violence and doing something about the private ownership of firearms. He talks about how there is widespread popular support for common sense policies and strategies. But he should know that this is something that is kind of confusing. In his previous chapters, he has talked about how the media often gets stuff wrong. They create a huge amount of furor where there is nothing. They create a lot of smoke where there is actually no fire. A lot of his stuff that he brings in at the end of the book saying people want this, is there evidence of that, or is it just something that the media talks about a lot? Is the actual supply of gun violence as high as the demand for gun control says that it is? And he says here at the end, countries across the globe, like Japan, still offer more concrete solutions, waiting for their American cousins to confront the material reality obscured by myth. And the myth that he's talking about is this myth that America is the gun country, that the Second Amendment covers private ownership of guns, all of these things that kind of are woven around our uniquely American identity, which we'll talk about in a second. But the other thing is this book is a tremendously, I would say, narrowly focused 20th century book. Now, there's a lot of stuff that's happened in the 20th century. A book that is 300 pages long and only talks about the 20th century, that's not a bad thing. But I will say that the topics that he is talking about go beyond, they go way back before the 20th century. But this idea that he is writing about, that nations like Japan can disarm their populations, that is a pretty 20th century idea. The idea of the modern nation state really coalesces in Europe in the 1800s. And then we start to do the same thing after the Civil War in the United States in the late 1800s. So it's in the 1900s that you see this modern nation state kind of come to fruition. You see it in slightly different political flavors. Russia obviously goes full hardcore authoritarian in a specifically communist direction, and then you see National Socialism and fascism implemented other places. But this idea that we are modern states now, people have a different role in the modern state than back when we were countries, feudal organizations. This modern state that is explored and developed in Europe and then in America and really dominates the geopolitical stuff that goes on in the 20th century is kind of what he is talking about here. He says here, in an American context, these ideas still seem radical. And the reason for that is America is still kind of an old-fashioned nation. Now, it wasn't that long ago that we were the new world, and Europe was the old world. But we have adopted some of these globalist ideas, some of these modern statist ideas, a lot slower than the rest of the world. We still have a lot of trappings of the traditional country as opposed to the modern nation state. That is why some of these ideas still seem radical. The rest of the world agrees, and they even laugh at America. This idea that the modern state would still have an armed populace is so backwards. It is so backwater. It is so preposterous. The only people who should be armed are the agents of the state. The people live in a perfect utopia created by the bureaucracy itself. Leviathan will protect the people. This is, I'm slight hyperbole, but this is the idea of the modern scientific secular state. And America is still this backwater nation, old-fashioned, still doing things the old way, still allowing people to take too much of their own freedoms into their own hands, still allowing the people to carry their own firearms around and hang them on the wall, where, dangerous things might happen. So he goes on, my pie-in-the-sky wish list would begin with abolition, a concept that has moved to the center of leftist politics in recent years. It definitely has, but only because the rest of politics has just gone hardcore left, as you have probably seen. Scholars and activists often use it to mean an end to the era of mass incarceration. More broadly, it means the abolition of state violence, and that must include the disarmament of police forces. Populations with justifiable suspicion of police would not and should not disarm first. So this is a very fascinating thing. I don't understand who he actually wants to own firearms, because he doesn't want, here, the police to have the firearms. He definitely doesn't want the private citizen to own the firearms. And then in the passage where he's talking about the 90s, he talks about Iraq. And even though he dunks on George W. Bush because Iraq turned out to have no weapons of mass destruction, he does point out that Iraq had far too many small arms that it had purchased on the international arms market. So there are even nations that he doesn't want to own firearms. So who does own firearms? Who does actually do the defense against evil? Who does actually protect the weak in his ideal scenario? His wish list doesn't really explain that. It just talks about decriminalization of a bunch of stuff and then disarmament of the police, and then somehow this magical utopia will occur. But then he goes on, and this is where you should pay especially close attention. My wish list would also include gun enthusiasts taking the historical Second Amendment seriously. Today's conservative Second Amendment is a product of the consumer's republic of 20th century, not the founder's republic of the 18th. This is one of the few areas in the entire book where he gets that historical. And he's only pointing out differences between the 20th and the 18th. The founders never intended it as a statement of market freedoms and consumer choice. Instead, since the 18th century, it has outlined a right tied to a duty. So I would agree that it is attached to a duty. All rights are attached to responsibilities, but they are private personal rights and they are private personal responsibilities. They are not group rights, and they do not have collective responsibilities or duties attached to them. He says, by owning a firearm, you have implicitly signed a compact that the founders wrote for citizen soldiers, not citizen consumers. This idea that there are different levels of citizens goes back to that modern scientific state. There will be different levels of people with different responsibilities and different values inside of these modern states. And this separation between the citizen soldier and the citizen consumer is kind of interesting. He says, Second Amendment t-shirts are for citizen consumers. Keeping and bearing arms in some form of well-regulated militia, registering your firearms with the state, engaging in regular supervised upkeep and training is for citizen soldiers. I'm not sure who he thinks will supervise the citizen soldier, because the cops are going to be disarmed, but that is how he sees the Second Amendment. Here's the issue with that. The way that the Second Amendment was written, it has two parts to it. There is that well-regulated militia being necessary, absolutely necessary for the preservation of a free state. The militia can only come out of a armed populace. The people who have individual rights and responsibilities must be armed. And I reject this idea that if you own a firearm, you have signed a contract that makes you a part of the militia. Because the founders were very clear on who was in the militia. It was not women, it was not old people, and it was not young people. And yet there are plenty of circumstances, not just in the 18th century, but in the 21st century, where old people and women and young people should in fact be armed. The weakest members of society should be able to defend themselves against violence that happens even outside of the sort of statist violence that your militia is equipped for, your militia is constituted for. When the need to do national defense occurs, that is when the militia comes out of the people. And the more training that they have ahead of time, the better. The better prepared they are before they muster as the militia, the better. They should have ongoing training. Supervised I'm actually great with supervised. We should figure out who supervises it. But this idea that only those people who are in that bracket that were specified by the founders, only those people in the bracket are the ones that are supposed to have the guns, I utterly reject, based on the fact that the founders had firearms in their homes for people who were too young, people who were too old, and people who were too female to be in the militia. Those categories of people were very much allowed to defend themselves using lethal force and using firearms. So, as we conclude this book, I am really curious to know how exactly Andrew McKevitt sees all of this playing out. If the firearms are for citizen soldiers only, and large swaths of the state are disarmed, and certain nation states are disarmed, and this gun capitalism is something that is completely reined in, who actually makes the guns and who actually owns the guns? How does this actually work? It isn't fully fleshed out in this book. I recommend this book only for people who want to read this middle section about the formation of some of the anti-gun groups in the 1960s. I think that is where the book really shines, and I think that is where the notes are particularly useful, these footnotes here. So that is the conclusion to this book review. I give it, I'm always conflicted by these. Ryan Bussey's book was another great example. I had high hopes for that book. He wrote a book about his time in the firearm industry. It was a memoir, and I was hopeful that it would be really interesting reading. But it was just a bunch of political grandstanding, which makes more sense now that he's running for the governor of Montana. And this book is similar. There's some solid academic research in here, but then there is, some grandstanding at the beginning and at the end. I don't really think that I can recommend this book for anything other than people who would like some great research on the 1960s and the 1970s stuff, but not this entire package, this idea that gun capitalism is thriving in America because of military surplus and anti-commie ideas from the 1950s, and that there's nothing prior to that. So that is the end of the book review of Gun Country, and next week we're actually going to be talking about a different book. It's not going to be a review, but we're going to be interviewing the author of this book, The White Horse King, The Life of Alfred the Great. The author is Dr. Ben Merkel. And we're going to be talking about Alfred the Great as a military commander, but also as a nation builder. It'll actually buttress a number of my points that I made talking about gun country, because not only do the ideas in America about citizens' responsibilities, the right to keep and bear arms, go all the way back to 1776, they actually go back before. And I'm going to make the case that they actually go all the way back to Alfred the Great himself. We're talking over 1,000 years ago. Foundations were put in place that we benefit from today. That'll be in the next episode.